Hi, everybody. This is Saad. I'm back in Montreal after a family trip to Southern California. Today, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about the current anti cop zeitgeist and where that will lead us. And in order to do so, I'm going to read arguably one of the most terrifying experiences from my childhood. Some of you who have read The Parasitic Mind, this book right here, might remember that in chapter one, I talked about the now famous pomegranate story. So, what I'd like to do is read that whole passage for you because it's going to serve as an important precursor to what happens when a society sinks into lawlessness and chaos. So, here we go. This is from The Parasitic Mind. Starts on chapter four, on page chapter one, page four, and then goes on to page five. So let me read you the whole thing, and then I will make some comments and link it to some stuff that's happening in the U.S. context in terms of defund the police and the soft on crime policies and so on. Prior to the start of the war, my parents had contracted a hand dryer service that provided a roll of washable textile which was installed on the wall of our kitchen. This was a precursor of the subsequent models of disposable hand drying tissues found in public bathrooms. Periodically, the same individual would come to our house to remove the dirty roll and replace it with a clean one. I believe his name was Ahmad or perhaps Muhammad. I thought that this was a rather strange service then, and even more so now as I recount the story. One evening, in the middle of the otherwise endless street to street fighting and continuous bomb shelling, I heard a knock at our door. I walked to the door and asked who was there. The reply came, quote, "It's me, Ahmed or Muhammad, the guy who changes your kitchen roll. Open the door, kid," closed quote. I delayed, and his insistence grew more sinister and forceful. Quote, "Open the door now," close quote. I ran to my mother. If memory serves me right, there were 4 occupants at our house that evening. My mother, my sister, who had returned to Beirut to visit us and was now stuck there, a male friend of my parents who was also stuck at our house even though he lived a short drive away, and myself. My father was not at home. I believe he was outside the country, but I can't remember why he was away. He eventually returned to Beirut and narrowly escaped death on the drive back to our home. My mother approached the door and talked through it with Ahmed, who was accompanied by 1 or more men. The exchange grew tense, and my mother fetched the male friend, who was cowering in another room. She hoped he might frighten them away, and I recall the disgust and anger that my mother expressed for this male friend's breathtaking cowardice in refusing to help. Within the brutality and chaos of the Civil War, there remained some semblance of law and order. As a last-ditch effort and against all odds, my mother phoned the police. The Arabic word for the outfit was 16. In Arabic, it's satash. And they took the call. Remember that this is during a full-blown war. Once they arrived at our house, we opened the door and let everyone into the kitchen. The lead policeman asked the men why they were there and who they were. Ahmed replied, quote, "Oh, my friends and I were in the mountains and we brought back a basket of pomegranate with us, and so we stopped by to give it to this family," close quote. After the policeman, I recall his impressive rifle by his side. After the policeman checked to confirm the contents of the basket, he stared coldly at Ahmad and said, quote, "Your connection to this family is that you changed their hand-drying roll and you decided to brave the street fighting and come in the middle of the night to offer them pomegranate? If I ever find you here again, you'll have serious problems," close quote. What happened next still gives me shivers down my spine. Ahmad looked at us and said very coldly and menacingly, quote, "I'll be back for you," close quote. We did not stay much longer in Lebanon after that incident, and so Ahmad never had a chance to, quote, visit us again. Now, why do I mention this story? First of all, in the context of the horrors that I witnessed in the Lebanese Civil War during that first year that we were there, this story stands as one of the most terrifying and an otherwise very, very terrifying childhood, because it really captures the sliding door principle, right? Had I been naive enough to open that door when he told me to open it up, had the police unit not come over, which could have been perfectly understandable given the brutality of the street to street fighting, many different outcomes could have happened that day. I may not be sitting here addressing you today. So on that first kind of grand metaphysical level, the sliding door story, the vicissitudes of life, it's a very powerful story. But it's of course also very sinister, right? Because it was clear what would have happened to us that evening had things not perfectly aligned. But now, why am I talking about this in the context of the anti-police rhetoric that we see in the United States coming from one political party? In the middle of the most brutal imaginable civil war, we were able to call on men who had taken an oath to protect the citizenry, and they came and they saved us. They didn't care about whether we were transgender or not. They didn't care whether we were black or white or Jewish or Christian or Muslim or anything. They had an oath to keep, and they came and they protected us, and we were able to escape Lebanon, not having experienced a much worse outcome that was awaiting us. So if nothing else, that story reminds me on how far we are from sinking into anarchy, lawlessness, and civilization and order, because there are people who have guns who are sworn to uphold the law. So when you have a society that then says, you know what, we're no longer going to lionize the people who take that oath. We're no longer going to say they are most courageous and our strongest and our fiercest. We're going to demonize them at every turn, at every corner, at every opportunity. They are racist. They are bigots. They are corrupt. They hunt down black people all day long, as LeBron James told us as he's coming from his home in Malibu or Beverly Hills. What the courage that he exemplifies in going to the Staples Center to train when he's being hunted every day by the police is just remarkable. And so now I want to link that to a couple of things that happened during this trip that I was in California. One of which is, some of you may have seen the story or the clip of this young guy, young black guy fighting a black cop in the subway. And it's just full on MMA, punching and wrestling and so on. Now, first of all, that a kid would be emboldened to physically engage in a, long fight with a cop already suggests that that's not a good harbinger, if you'd like, of where society is going. But then when the kid was arrested, and by the way, he was I think a felon. He had been arrested previously on weapons charges, of course released. But then after he has a massive fight with the cop, he's released shortly thereafter. And I'm sure that he won't be put away in prison. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you start physically fighting, with a cop, you're gone 5 years to prison, maybe more. Now, it's not because the cop is a special person. He's got more, because he or she represents the law. He or she represents the side of, one side of the track is lawlessness, anarchy. The other side is what keeps us safe when we walk in the streets, right? So when you have DAs and prosecutors and the whole machinery of progressive soft on crime policies, whereby the criminals are the victims, right? Where it's wrong to incarcerate them. It's wrong to be tough on crime. We need to give them chances. The reason why they are criminal, according to the progressive policy, is because society has wronged them. So you remove the personal agency from the criminal, and you say that it's society's fault, and therefore to incarcerate them, to punish them, is a double whammy against them. So you have to be soft on them. You have to you have to play them reggae music and hold hands and kumbaya and give them a peace through cucumbers and so on. And so what happens? You end up having a whole generation of kids who don't fear the law. I don't know if you saw another clip that came out of Minnesota where there were these young kids, I mean, literally 2 years old maybe, who were, swearing at the cops. The cops, by the way, were also black. The kids were black and the cops were black. So the reason I mentioned their race is because you can't then argue that it's due to white supremacy and they're fighting against the white man and so on. So the kids 2 years old are saying words that I would recoil if my teenage daughter heard, but the kids were saying them to the cops. They were punching the cops, and the cops, of course, were in a no-win situation. They're trying to kind of stop the kids from abusing them, from hitting them. So those are two little snippets. One, the fight in the subway station between the cop and the kid. Another one with the 2-year-olds really physically attacking the cops. Obviously, they're only 2, 3 years old, but the fact that they are emboldened, right? The natural instinct would be for a kid to be afraid of an older person, a person of authority. So if at 2 or 3 years old they're sufficiently emboldened, sufficiently brazen to go toe to toe and attack a cop who's got a gun that's bigger than you, what is that kid going to do when he's 12 or 14, or when he sees a helpless old lady passing in the street? Well, what you end up having is what happened with a bunch of kids beat an elderly man to death. And of course, they will probably get no punishment. I'm not sure. I think this happened maybe in Philadelphia. Uh, by the way, when I was just on this trip, and we were staying in Newport Beach, and there's a very nice area in Newport Beach where in that particular village you're not allowed to engage in any solicitations. And so there was this kid who was walking around trying to, it was a scam, buy chocolates from me and so on. And the security gentleman, who looked like a spitting image of Denzel Washington, and we got to know him well. We chatted with him many times. He's a black gentleman. Again, I mentioned his race because the kids who were loitering around and trying to cause trouble and solicit and so on were also black. Well, at one point, this gentleman is probably around my age. Seems like a really stand-up guy, very polite, very professional. At one point, I saw him engaging in a very, very heated exchange with the kid. There were two kids. One was a boy and a girl. Well, the boy was maybe 14, 15. He was being very, very threatening, that he was threatening the gentleman and so on. And the gentleman was trying to talk him down, but also to speak to him, to say, I'm old enough to be your dad. I'm old enough to be maybe even your grandfather, he was telling us later. And I had gone up to the gentleman after I had overheard the conversation. I said, my God, what a difficult job you have, because you don't even have the badge of the cop. Even that wouldn't scare him. But, you're a privately hired, security guard, and yet you're taking your job with such honor, with such dignity, and you're trying to talk down, de-escalate the situation with this kid. But that kid wasn't afraid of him. That kid felt no shame. Well, where does that come from? I don't think he's born that way, but it comes from the zeitgeist of anti-authority, anti-discipline, anti-cops. That doesn't breed healthy, civilized societies. It breeds anarchy. And again, to go back to the pomegranate story, we were able to call the cops during arguably the most brutal civil war imaginable, and they came. So there is nothing progressive or liberal or noble about hating on cops. They put their lives on the line so that you can walk your dog, hopefully safely. And by the way, don't get me started on the Second Amendment, because one of the other things that US has, which now when I return to Canada, I realize what a feminized society we are. In the US, you still have the dignity of being able to defend yourself. I was hanging around on the strip with an old friend of mine who just retired from the FBI, and he still carries a gun. He showed me his gun, and we were walking around. And I was thinking to myself, why is it that this gentleman can walk around, and if something goes bad, he doesn't need to wait for the cops to come. he can defend himself and his property and his family. Whereas I, on the other hand, in Canada, have subcontracted that most basic individual right to the state. Justin Trudeau has actually said there is no such such basic right as you protecting yourself. Really? What is there more in terms of your survival instinct than to be able to defend yourself when you're being attacked? Well, in a socialist utopia, the government will defend you. And if it turns out that you called and they were too busy or they didn't have enough manpower to get to you, well, sorry, you die, but at least you live in a socialist utopia where we are all unarmed, where we are all equal in our miserable lives. So, take away from the story, respect the cops. Not all cops are good. Just like any human endeavor, there are a few bad apples. But given the number of contacts that happen on a daily basis between cops and people of all races and all walks of life, it is actually shockingly minuscule statistically the number of bad outcomes that are due to police misbehavior. Have a good day, everybody. Cheers.